Aim higher and swing harder. Just because you've invested heavily into an idea and you realize that it's not a good idea, don't double down on a bad idea.
All right, welcome to the Mark Faris Experience. Super excited for our guest today. We have Brian Warner, a serial entrepreneur. What an amazing story that Brian has, and looking forward to getting into it. Brian scaled a multi-million-dollar business, oversaw 120 team members, basically grew his business from zero and scaled it up to 30 locations that he personally opened each and every one, and was able to really make it to I like to call it, make it to the NHL of business by going full cycle and actually selling the business. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Mark.
Yeah. So Brian, can you share a little bit about your backstory and what inspired you to start your own business?
It really started when I was younger. Like, I started working when I was like 13. I had like a paying job, right? So I've always been, wanting to make money, right? Wanting to work, but and quickly, when I was younger, I worked at like a pizza shop. I did landscaping. And I just quickly, I was always looking at how to do things better, make things like just, put my all into everything, but always looking for almost shortcuts in a way. And then I'd start scratching my head, like, why are we doing things this way instead of that way? And so I always just sort of had a mind for, looking at how businesses operate. And then I also quickly realized I don't like working for other people, right? It was, not that I would raise conflict or anything, but I just realized that, I could do this and I could do it better, kind of thing, or I would like to try. But I was never arrogant to always think that I knew the best. I wasn't one of those employees that would always be a know-it-all or anything. I would just sort of watch and observe. And so right almost out of the gate, like once I was past those sort of high school jobs kind of thing, I just started working for myself. And when I was younger, I never really had a clear direction. I was always envious of those people that in high school, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go and I'm going to be a pilot, or I'm going to go. And like, they always seem to have a clear direction. I never knew what I wanted because I was never really passionate about a thing, right? I was just interested, I would almost become passionate about whatever the flavor of the week kind of thing was, right? Whatever I was involved in, I would just become passionate about it kind of thing. And I'd always throw myself into it, but there was never one thing that and I think that's, I wish when I was younger, maybe I had a mentor that said that, you don't have to. I kept trying to find a passion, right? Because that's the story you hear from everybody is that, find a passion and follow it. And I'm like, well, what if I can't find a passion? I've got nothing to follow, right? So I was enrolled to go to university for business and commerce because I'm like, well, that's just, an easy way to go. Again, what do you do when you don't have any direction, right? And then at the last minute, it's a really weird story. At the last minute, I'm at the gym and one of my acquaintances there said, hey, I'm going to massage therapy school, right? And this is like, even now I look back and I'm like, I don't know what. So whatever, I decided to not go to business and commerce and I went to massage therapy school, right? Cause he's like, yeah, you just go, it's like a 2-year program and you come out and, you're making $60 an hour or something. And at the time, $60 an hour seemed like a lot of money to me at the time, right? Because again, I sort of grew up with pretty humble means, right? Didn't have a lot. My dad was a taxi driver, and so $60 an hour sounded like a lot of money, and to be able to just get in and get out and start making money right away. So I'm like, this sounds great, right?
Yeah.
So I did that for quite a while. But again, very quickly, I was like, okay, I'm doing this. How do I charge more money, right? And then I quickly, I'm like, well, I got to increase my skill set, right? So then I went and I would take specialized courses and I would basically keep upgrading my skills, and then I would keep charging people more money, right? Is sort of so it's interesting now, like you hear on all these, the self-help gurus and stuff like that. And that's a common practice now that, one way to lead to success is improve yourself, right? So I kind of look back on that, and intuitively, by doing that, it's like, how do you make more money, or how do you be more successful, is provide more value to people. So I saw that, again, just intuitively, it wasn't like I was consciously aware of that, but it was that if I go and improve myself by learning new skills, learning new modalities, learning new things, I can charge more because I'm bringing more value to the table, right? So and that's a literal cause and effect, which is, it's funny when I look back on, right? So I basically tapped out. Like I went through all the things. And then I started looking at, okay, I'm stuck now because I'm making, let's say, $90 an hour now at the time, right? Which was a lot. This was 20 something years ago. So for me, $90 an hour, I'm doing pretty well. But again, I need to work. And then I was like, well, how do I make more money? Well, I've got to work more hours.
Right.
So there was this. So then I'm like, okay, well, how do I leverage that? So then I went into acupuncture, because I'm like, oh, I can now be treating multiple people at the same time, right? And so I went in. I spent 4 years, sort of in my spare time, learning acupuncture, and then started integrating that into the practice. And so then again, I hit this threshold where to make more money, I need to earn more, or work more hours, right? And I think at the time, maybe I was making 100. I'd like take home 100,000 a year or something like that, right? And I had set this goal because I'm like, oh, I want to make. Again, intuitively, I didn't really have any mentors, didn't really know what I was doing, but I was just like, oh, $100,000 a year. That seems to be the number that everybody talks about. That's
Right.
good. If you're making 100,000, you're doing okay.
I remember when
right?
that was the big leagues. I remember that 100,000 goal, as a young and as a teenager growing up, even as a young adult, I remember that number, that 100,000 number, right? It was big. It was big time. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like when we were growing up, that was, and even now, 100,000 is nothing to shake a stick at, right? So the building that I'm working at was with a bunch of doctors, and we would all park in the back of the building. And at the time, I'm driving a BMW. I'm a big car fanatic, right? So I'm driving a BMW, and one of my friends, who became a friend, he's driving a Nissan Pathfinder, I remember. So here we've got a doctor, and he'd pull up and he's like, Brian, I'm doing something wrong here. He's like, I'm a doctor and I'm driving around in a Nissan, and you're a massage guy driving around in a BMW, right? And he's like, what's going on here, right? And so we would laugh about it anyways, right? And yeah, so, but again, quickly I hit that threshold, and I'm like, okay, so how do I make $200,000? And so the only way to do it would be to then scale out a big practice or something like that, hire more people. So then I started to realize that, okay, I've got to hire more people. But I had friends that operated various clinics, and it just, I don't know, it just didn't resonate with me, right? So at the time, I was investing in my extra money. I was investing in real estate in Toronto. So this was another thing. This was when Toronto was going through a big price boom, right? And prices were almost, we went through this time where they would double, like you could make good money. So part of the success was I had invested in some pre-construction condos at the time, and just, and I'd always been interested in real estate. So again, in my spare time, I go and get my real estate license, because I'm like, oh, I know real estate agents and they make $250,000 a year. So it was funny. So that was my goal that I set, 250. So I think in 9 months, I got my real estate license. And then I immediately go working for a company as an agent, and in my first year, 250,000, right? And and I think for it was Remax at the time, and they have like a little. That's like you get a little trophy award at the end of the year for hitting that
And
number,
how
right?
were you able to do that, hit the 250 within that first year? Like, what was it that you did that, like, that's just not normal to be able to do that in your first 12 months? Like, what do you think that you were able to do that most agents, when they start, just never get done?
I don't know exactly what the secret sauce was. For me, it's whenever I set a goal, then in my mind it wasn't an if, it was always an inevitability, right? And then it's almost like the things just conspire to make that happen, right? But like, don't get me wrong, I was grinding it out, right? Like every lead, every like I was just doing the
Right.
things, right?
Taking massive action.
Yeah, and I think so interesting that the broker of record at the so I got involved, and it was just through again these decisions I make were just somebody would say something and I would just pull the trigger, right? So again, the real estate idea popped into my head. So without even analyzing it I just went and took the course. And then I knew somebody that worked at this brokerage. So I just went and worked for that brokerage. Like I never overthought things. I didn't shop around and see who I just went. That just seemed to be the next obvious choice. So I remember, this is a great story because I remember my very first deal. Um, I sold this house in Markham for 450,000, double ended the deal, my first deal. And so I'm in the office the next morning and I'm doing the paperwork there. And the broker of record, and I'm just beaming, right? I'm so happy. And the broker of record comes up and she's like, what are you doing? And I'm so proud. And I think she's going to give me a big pat on the back, right? And I said, look, I just closed my first deal. I'm just doing the paperwork and so I could submit the deal, right? And she's like, it's 10 o'clock. We've got a house tour going on. She's like, paperwork can be done anytime. You need to be out there. She's like, and this stuck with me. This was I always think of this. She said, your job is to get out there and meet people, network, sell houses, buy houses, right? Like, so always focus on what your job is not paperwork. So you do your paperwork at 11 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning, or what? You don't do your paperwork at 10 o'clock in the morning when you should be out at open houses, when you should be out networking, right?
Love that. I love that. That is so good. That nugget, that is such a huge nugget. I think a lot of people, when they get into business, they think that showing up at the office and processing paperwork is the business. And it's not the business. The business is to get out and essentially to lead gen, to get out and bring in new business. That is your business.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Lead gen, right?
Yeah.
Lead generation is the business of real estate in particular, right? And the transaction is not the job. And so one of my sort of skills is that I'm able to distill things down to the simplest, to the fundamentals. And from that, what I took from that was pointy end of the stick. Always focus on the pointy end of the stick, right? So if you're a hunter, and you've got to provide food for your tribe, your only focus is what is going to be at the end of that stick, right? You don't care about anything else. Don't get distracted. Always focus on the pointy end of the stick. And I use that analogy when I'm speaking to my staff, and I always refer back to that lesson I learned, that was just a key nugget, like you said. And she just dropped it as if it was nothing, which was, you know, and I see this as probably one of the biggest mistakes I see in entrepreneurs is they get busy doing the things they like to do that are the most gratifying to them, right? And it's fun doing the paperwork, right? Paperwork in itself, but when you've got a deal and once you submit that deal that's your paycheck, right? And you're sitting there so in that moment, that was the most gratifying thing for me to do. But she reminded me that's not the most important thing to do, right? You should be out there generating leads when people are receptive to it, kind
I
of thing.
love that. And Brian, what do you think in business, if you were to generalize, what do you think the pointy end of the stick, if you're going to focus on one number in any business, what is, and you're saying, okay, this is the pointy end of the stick. If you were to generalize it, what should entrepreneurs focus on?
When it comes to business, for me, the pointy end of the stick changes depending on the day, right? But I would say in general in business, what I've encountered is that the pointy end of the stick is money.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that in a sort of trivial sort of, like you and I know each other well, and money isn't my driving factor, right? But a business is measured in money, right? If you're not making money, it's a hobby, right? And so your goal in business is to generate money, right? That's how we measure. That's the yardstick that we're using to measure business success. And now that's not to say, and again, don't get me wrong, in my businesses, I operate within morals and ethics, and I want, like, all of those great things that I want to improve my community, improve people's lives, and I want to be of a benefit. But at the end of the day, what's the pointy end of the stick, right? Is, well, the more successful the business is, the more money it generates, the more people you can help, the more services you can offer, so, and I think people lose sight of that. And I think in society, I find that gets lost in the translation. And we've been told to not be greedy, to not be, and it's one thing to focus on the money, the objective, and not be greedy about it, right? But so for me, that's because oftentimes people come in and they're, they'll just ask for a little bit of advice or whatever. And I look at their business and I'm like, well, where's the money trail here, right? And then let's work backwards from that. So, it's like I said, but given each different day or given a different department, what's the pointy end of the stick, right? So if I'm speaking to the marketing department, well, the pointy end of the stick is lead gen. And that's a great, I've worked with teams that they get so caught up in trying to make something beautiful, and it's almost like an ego project, right? And at the end, and I'll sit down and tear it apart, not in a cruel way, but basically say, guys, how does this draw people into the door? How does this activate new customers? And when you run it through that filter, they're like, oh, I've missed my mark, right? So the pointy end of the stick here is I'm trying to bring in new customers. So do we need all this? Is this just something that you're doing to stroke your own ego, right?
Yeah, 100%. And you nailed it in regards to money. It's a measuring stick. And the reality here is that the more revenue a company can bring in, the more people you can help, the more talent you can bring on, the more you can improve your culture. Really, business is a game. And the reality is playing any game and not having a scoreboard, knowing if you're winning or losing, it's not fun. Like, you imagine going to a hockey game and, they're playing the game out there, they're working really hard, but you just don't know what the score, the players don't know what the score is. It's just, that's silly. And it's funny because a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't know what the true score is. And I just think that's a really good focus point for entrepreneurs is, the reality is how is a company doing from a financial standpoint? And revenue is one that in general I've found to be really, really good. But I love that.
Just to add to that, you could take that statement and you could twist it, where then all of your decisions are just based on the financial figure at the end of the day. And that is not the goal, right? Because I've seen a lot of businesses that they only care about the bottom line. They don't care about the people. They don't. So there's a fine line. It's basically saying, like, to your point, that's how we score the game, right? But it doesn't mean that's how we play the game. And, you can play the game with integrity, and you can still try to win. And how we measure that is in. So that's the balance that because I've had people that sort of caught me up in those, in that, and sort of take what I'm saying at a literal,
Right.
Oh, so you only think about the money. And I'm like, no, it couldn't be farther from the truth. But that's how we score the game. Exactly like you said.
Well, and we've seen this in business, in our businesses as well, and the real estate brokerage and then the real estate investment firm, is the better we treat our people, the more productive they naturally are, which then drives revenue even further. They do better, they're happier. It's if you just focus on the numbers like you had mentioned there and think that squeezing everything is the way to actually make it grow, you actually make it grow by pouring into people, and then the byproduct is the growth of the revenue really in the company, right?
Exactly.
Love
Yeah.
that. Okay. So you are an agent, top agent now. Now you had an opportunity dropped in your lap, and take us through that journey of scaling a company from zero. And just before we do, I mean, you dropped a couple really good points. I just want to make sure our listeners really get this. At the beginning, when you started, you thought that, you had to find the passion. And that there's a big misconception out there. Is like, I got to find my passion before I start anything. The reality is you just saw an opportunity and you said, I'm just going to start. And that was being a massage therapist. And so you started and you took action. And so I think a lot of entrepreneurs out there, they're just waiting for that passion. And I found this when I started in real estate. I didn't particularly love selling real estate. I loved real estate investing when I started, but it was more around, that was the opportunity that I saw at the time. And it started to become a passion of mine as I did it thousands of times and I got better at it. Right. But then that opened up another door for me. So I think taking action and overcoming this misconception that you need to follow your passion is, it's not always the way that things start. And most times I'd say it's not. And so that was your first key nugget there that you dropped that I just want to make sure people catch. And the next one is this mindset about making money. It's like you had a question of, how do I make more? And you realize that this was not about working more hours. You only had so many hours in the day. This is about becoming more valuable. And the way that you make more money was you need to increase your skill sets. And I just, man, that's such a nugget there. It's like, you became more value, you got extra skills, and you started thinking, how can I add more value to the marketplace? That was so good. And then you just never overthought ideas. I think that is such a great nugget here as well, is when there was an opportunity that was presented to you, you took fairly quick action on that as well. And I've seen that with entrepreneurs out there, that they're very quick to take action on ideas once they have all the data points. They move quick. And so that's where maybe that's a really good transition now, taking to this idea that was popped in your lap, and maybe take us through how you scaled that business to a full exit.
Yeah, so I'll gloss over sort of a few of the details and just sort of jump into. So that friend I was telling you, that my doctor friend who was driving the Nissan. So we're out having dinner. Again, I'm changing the story a little bit just to sort of get to the point here, because it'll take too long. But basically, we're out having dinner with a couple of his friends and a couple of his golf buddies, and so we're at dinner, and his two friends had started one of the three at the time. There were three registered medical cannabis companies in Canada. So this was before we went through the whole legalization process in Canada. And I know in the US, it's sort of going through the same thing, but it's a slightly different, just the way the states are set up. So at that time, it was illegal, but it was legal through a licensed producer that was registered by the government, right? So these guys had started one of the three locations. And the problem was, so here's the way, because the government basically said, oh, we're forced by the courts to allow this to happen. But you could see they were just trying to prevent it from happening, right? So what they did is they gave these growers and these, big organizations the ability to grow and sell, but they weren't allowed to advertise and they weren't allowed to directly communicate with the public, and they couldn't. So here you are, imagine you're making this product and it's sitting in your warehouse, but you're not allowed to tell people you have something for sale.
Right. Yeah.
And so what they would do is, through word of mouth and everything, is they would, patients through research and everything would find, and then they would contact them, right? So it was really word of mouth. But in the early stages, so you needed a prescription. You needed a prescription from a doctor to access medical cannabis. Well, there was no doctors willing to write prescriptions, right? So these guys had approached my friend and said, hey, we have a bunch of medical patients that just need legal access, and all they need is a prescription. So if we can send them to your office, and then you can meet with them, assess them, and decide. So just through that relationship, my friend became well-versed in medical cannabis and how to prescribe. And so he would get, like, busloads of people would show up. So he'd close down his family practice and he would get a busload of people, 50 people showing up. And he would be writing these prescriptions, seeing them, assessing them. And he'd be there all night, basically filling out these prescriptions. And then they would then be able to go to the licensed producer and order the product, right? So right away at this dinner, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. We have a manufacturer essentially of a product, right? Or a producer of a product. And then we have a customer, and they're not allowed to communicate, basically, right? They have no way, the customer doesn't know. So I'm like, right here, right in that middle point and whatever happened in that dinner, I went home, jumped on the internet, and I just dove in. I literally I don't think I slept that weekend, right? And I'm figuring this out, and I'm like, oh my God, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these people looking, but there are no doctors prescribing, and there's no, it's just
found a gap in the marketplace there. Yeah. So again, it goes back to the taking, you did your research, and then what happened then?
Yeah. So Monday morning, and I'm almost like I don't think I slept, like I said. So I go and I meet with my friend, and I'm like, hey, can you set up a meeting with your golf buddies? I've got an idea, right? And so I talked it over with him, and he's like, yeah, I'm in, right? And so we set up a meeting with these guys, and I say, look, we'll be I'll get the patients, right? And we'll write the prescriptions, and we'll send them to you, right? And they're like, yeah, okay, great, we're in, right? So we formed this partnership. And so overnight, I don't know how to do anything. I went and built a website. So this was like over 10 years ago. Like now, everything's so different, right? Like now with AI and everything, you can build a website in 10 minutes. You can do all, right? But back then, everything was still sort of at the early stages, right? But I think I built a website on WordPress, right? And it was either WordPress or GoDaddy or one of these. So I built the website, and then Google Ads was, so I basically just put an ad up on Google Ads, and then that was it. And then I grabbed one of my staff and I pulled her aside and I said, hey, do you want to do a new project with me? And she's like, yeah, sure. So I'm like, okay, here's the plan, right? I need you to answer these emails and then book these people in for an appointment, right? And we were running, so sorry to backtrack. So we had a medical wellness facility that we were running. So literally overnight, we start getting this trick. So the next week, we've got like 50, 60 patients, right? And it's my friend, and he's coming in, giving a couple hours. So within 2 weeks, I've got a backlog of patients, and my friend doesn't have enough time to see them all.
Right. So you prove the model pretty quick that this works.
Yeah, and there's a demand. There's people out there looking, and literally Google ad, right? I just threw a Google ad. Are you looking for, prescription for cannabis kind of thing, right? Do you need
So,
help?
okay, so I want to make sure to get this because we're coming up a little bit short on time here, and we're definitely, Brian, we're going to need to jump on a different one because there's so many nuggets. Now, from going from that idea, proving the model out to 120 team members to exiting, through that period, what piece of advice would you give an entrepreneur that you're like, this was we'll just say a key part to scaling and getting to a point of being able to sell a company? What if you were to give one kind of key idea that was like super helpful that helped you get there? What would that be?
So what led to that is through that process, we had Health Canada, the College of Physicians and Surgeons. Everybody was trying to prevent this wave from happening,
Yeah.
right? So they would keep changing the rules on us, and they say, well, you can't do it this way, right? So then we'd have to find a solution. You can't do it that way, and then we'd have to find a solution, right? So through this whole thing, it was just constantly uh, find a roadblock, and then like now it's this common term, you got to pivot, right? You got to be flexible and pivot. So it's whenever you encounter a roadblock, you have to be able to react, right? So it's just so the big thing is never being tied to an idea, and if you've invested in something, this was something I heard. I think it was like I was watching Dragon's Den or something like that, and it really resonated with me, and I sort of took it as my own. Just because you've invested heavily into an idea and you realize that it's not a good idea, don't double down on a bad idea.
Never being tied to an idea and always knowing that you have an exit if that's the wise thing to do, and not doubling down on a bad idea. I love that. That's such great insight.
Yeah, and so through this journey, it was always again focus on the pointy end of the stick. So through all the distractions, through all of the what was my objective? So again, to sort of jump to the end of the story, we started off and then we just kept scaling and growing and growing. And then eventually it was like, hey, I want an exit strategy, right? So then I basically approached the guys and said, you guys need to be vertically integrated. What you guys need to do is just buy the clinics, right? And then that sort of went to it, right? It was always like, okay, great. How do I make more money, right, out of this? Because again, to your point, like I wasn't passionate about cannabis. I wasn't, I don't even personally like it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
And it was a joke with all my friends because it was like, they're like, oh, you're like, and they know I don't even, anyway. So to that point about being passionate about something, I was passionate about the industry, and for all purposes, everybody thought I was like all in, and I was because I became passionate about it, right? And the stories, like we'd have these young kids coming in with seizure disorders and having like 20 seizures a day, and then they get on some medical cannabis and it's manageable for them, right? So I'd start to see these stories, and then that would drive my passion. Is I'm like, I know there's 1,000 more of these kids out there, and or these other people with. So it was my passion grew, and then I almost became like a crusader for the movement because I'm like,
Yeah.
this needs to happen.
Well,
right?
and you could see how your business affected people, impacted people positively, and then that I could see how that would add more fuel to the fire. And you seeing a challenge out there and overcoming challenges along the way, you're probably one of the best that I've seen out there on doing that, and that's what makes you such a great entrepreneur. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. We got rapid fire. You ready for the 3 quick questions here, just to wrap everything up here, Brian?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, I hope so.
Okay, so what was your favorite book that you think had the biggest impact either on your business or on wealth creation overall?
So, I have to, because again, this is 20 years ago. The book that changed my mind was Rich Dad Poor Dad, and I know that for me was it it was a light bulb moment for me when I read that book, that I'm like, oh, and for that triggered me to realize working by the hour, how to scale, how to leverage time, all those concepts were just sort of realized for me. So for me, not to say that's my favorite book of all time, but that for me, I think that was the most important book uh, for me, especially back then before YouTube and all of these other things. There was no way, we don't have access to all the stuff like we
It's
do
a
now.
classic, one of my favorites too. How would people describe you in, say, 3 words? What would be the 3 words that would describe Brian Warner if people were to describe you?
Uh, I think determined,
Yeah.
um, tenacious, uh, and kind.
I know you well, Brian. I agree with all 3 of those. I think that's well described. And then final piece of advice that you would give your younger self.
Aim higher and swing harder.
Oh, I love that. Aim higher and swing harder. Oh man. Brian, you dropped some major nuggets here on this on the show. I appreciate you a lot. If any of the listeners want to find out a little bit more about what you're currently doing, where could they go to check out your current businesses that you're focusing on right now?
Well, my big focus right now is I'm involved with, I'm on the board of directors for a company called Dynacert. And I'm passionate about it because I think it's going to change the world. It's yeah, we won't get into it, but it's hydrogen. It's helping clean the environment. It's anyway. So if you go check out Dynacert, that's where my passion is right now. And I got in on the cannabis industry at the very beginning, and I think we're in at the hydrogen industry again. So that's my next big project, and I, it's going places. We're having a really great year. Things are just finally falling into place, so it's really good. So it's not you won't see me sort of personally, but that's what I'm. You'll see me on the board of directors there. But if you check out that company, that's where my passion is, and that's where the future is for me.
Very cool. Well, we'll make sure to include that in the show notes here. Brian, appreciate you a lot. And moving forward there, guys, make sure to check out our next show where we speak to entrepreneurs about building businesses and wealth. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mark.